Let me start by prefacing this. I believe 1000% that Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 2 had so much potential to be great that I, without a doubt, believe that it could have been at least equal to Season 1's story, if not surpass it. There are way too many things within the season that were thrown away or just not implemented in the story that would have made the experience of playing the season so much better. How I'm going to go about doing this video is going by each episode explaining what happens within the story to revitalize your memory of Season 2. By the time I'm done explaining, thereon, I will then give my 100% explanation as to why Season 2 of Telltale's The Walking Dead had a downfall. Of course, if you're already familiar with the story, then I'll leave a timestamp in the video for those who want to go straight into what I have to say. For those who want to get the whole experience of the video, then stick around and enjoy. So before we even get into Season 2, I have to talk about Season 1. Not the whole thing, of course, rather a small portion of the game that I believe is very important to go over. That portion being our last moments with Lee. More specifically, Lee's final moments with Clementine, as Lee is slowly dying in the jewelry store. Up until this point in the game, we of course experience Lee and Clementine introduce themselves to each other and go through this horrific but emotional ride with each other, so much so that in such a short time frame, they've grown to be very close with each other, so much so that they're like father and daughter. All the experiences that they both endured with each other has led up to this point where Lee can either tell Clementine to shoot him or have her leave him. But the portion after the decision of whether to do either of those things is what I want to talk about. After Lee decides on what Clementine should do about him, before saying his goodbyes, he mentions to Clementine that she is just as capable of handling herself as anyone else and gives instructions as well as pieces of advice to help her along her journey, of not having anybody around to look after her since Lee won't be there.
You're strong, Clem. You can do anything.
But I'm little.
Doesn't mean nothing. You're gonna see bad stuff, but it's okay. Always keep moving. You're gonna want to find someplace like the motor inn, but that's just not safe.
Shortly after, the decision that Lee gives to Clementine eventually comes to life, thus Clementine is alone. Of course, at the after credits, we do see Clementine is alone until she sees two figures in the distance which she thinks could be potential threats, but once we get into the Season 2, we find out that the two figures are actually Omid and Krista, and whom she ended up being with after Lee's death. Anyways, the reason why I want to talk about the scene real quick is to give you guys a basis of what Clementine was supposed to be more or less shown in Season 2. That is to be able to handle herself and make her own decisions. But right now, I will come back to this and mention it later because it ties in what I want to talk about. For now, let's get into the story of Season 2 of Telltale's The Walking Dead. Starting Season 2, we get to see Clementine is with Krista and Omid, in which time passes, thus her spending a bit of time with them. The group ends up taking a quick stop at the gas station to freshen up. Clementine goes into the bathroom, but upon using it, she notices that the door opened, knowing that whoever walked into the bathroom is neither Krista or Omid. A random woman appears in the bathroom and forces Clementine to come out, threatening her with her own gun that she left on the sink. As the woman is searching Clementine's things, the bathroom door opens once again and we see Omid trying to reach for the gun, but as the door closes and creaks, the woman takes notice of Omid and shoots him in the chest, killing him instantly. Krista rushes inside, noticing her now dead husband in the woman, and proceeds without hesitation killing the woman with her rifle. And thus we get a time skip of 16 months where we see both Clementine, who's a little bit older, and Krista, who's heartbroken over Omid, and odds are in the back of her head blames Clementine partially for Omid's death, but still takes care of her regardless. Krista heads out to find some wood in hopes to keep the fire going. While Clementine tries to be helped by keeping the fire up, she hears voices in the distance. Curious, she carefully walks towards the noise and finds Krista surrounded by a few men who antagonize her if she's with a group or not. Clementine then has the choice of whether or not to distract the men or sneak away, but either way she ends up making a run for it from one of the men. In short, Clementine succeeds in escaping but tramples into a river and is carried by the current. Fast forward and Clementine is now washed up on the shore by herself and thus wanders around in the woods. As she's walking in the woods, she ends up finding a dog named Sam and finds a nearby campsite to scavenge out of. In short, Sam dies, and Clementine wanders yet again in the woods, eventually meeting up with two strangers who we find out their names being Luke and Pete. Luke and Pete introduce themselves and say that they'll take Clementine to a doctor, but soon before getting to the house, Luke notices the bite mark that Clem got from the dog and proceeds to panic thinking it was a walker bite. Clementine goes to say it wasn't, and so the three of them head to the house, but Clem passes out before reaching the building. Clementine wakes up in front of the group and people who we shall call the cabin group since they all live in a cabin. The group discuss what to do with Clementine and shortly come to an agreement to lock her in the shed overnight. As the cabin group do just that, Clementine sneaks to get medical supplies inside the house. With the help of a few of the group members, she succeeds and heads back to the shed to stitch her arm. As Clementine finishes stitching her arm, she gets snuck on by a walker in which she ends up killing, but the noise that came from the shed was heard by the cabin group. Witnessing what Clementine did, they agree to bring her in, obviously some of them not agreeing with the situation. Clementine at the dinner table talks to Luke about her past and how she ended up being in the position that she got into, talking about Lee and the people that helped her along the way. Pete comes along with a few others before him that intervene in Clementine and Luke's conversation. He goes on to say that the group should turn in, that way they can catch fish for tomorrow's dinner. The group do just that, and so Pete, Nick, and Clementine head down to the river to catch some fish. Upon arriving there, they witness that bodies have just recently been killed there, and so Pete and Nick come to a realization that Carver must be the one to be responsible for the killing. Pete orders the two to search around the area to see if they can find information as to what happened to them. But while they were searching, Pete gets nabbed by a nearby walker and gets bit by the ankle. But the noise that Pete just made attracted more walkers, in which Clementine has a choice of whether or not to follow Pete or Nick. After making either choice, that wraps up the end of episode 1. Starting in episode 2, depending on who you went with, that being Nick or Pete, we still get to see Clementine escaping from either the bunker her and Nick were held up in, or the vehicle her and Pete were in, heading back towards the cabin house. As Clementine arrives back at the house, she gets informed by Carlos and Rebecca that Luke and Alvin went searching for them. Since Clementine tells them that either Pete or Nick were left behind, those two then go out to look for Luke and Alvin. With that, they decide to leave Clementine responsible with the house and Sarah. Also that she shouldn't open the door for anyone. Clementine does just that, but soon the two hear noises outside, thinking at first that it was Luke. Instead, the person that arrives at the house and who ends up walking in is a man who we soon find out later is named being Carver. Carver arrives and asks some questions in regards to the people that he's looking for that accurately describe the group that Clementine is with currently. The man soon leaves, and thus the group make it back to the cabin. Clementine and Sarah inform everyone about what happened, and so they make the decision to ditch the cabin to head to the Blue Ridge Mountains. 5 days later, the group come upon a bridge in which Luke and Clementine go towards to make sure it was safe to cross. After dealing with some walkers on the bridge, they soon after come across an armed man who also is occupying the bridge. The man asks some questions, but soon we find out that the man is friendly and offers the group some supplies in the nearby station on the other side of the bridge. Before finishing his final thoughts, the three of them see Nick on the other side of the bridge aiming his rifle at the man. Though Luke and Clementine tell Nick not to shoot, he does so regardless, killing him. The group head onwards to the ski lodge that they saw earlier before the bridge eventually arriving there. Scoping out to see if the place is secure, they meet up with another group, which both groups go after each other until Clementine takes notice that there's a man that she recognizes, whom we see that this man is Kenny. Since Clementine and Kenny know each other, they stop the discourse and so they dine together after one of the people from Kenny's group, Walter, makes everyone a meal. Walter then asks Clementine whether she could lend him a hand outside. Walter talks to Clementine about the world beforehand until Kenny ends up joining them outside. The three soon find a woman named Bonnie who asks for food, and Walter generously gives her a big portion for her to take back to her family. Later on, the wind turbines run faster than they originally were due to an upcoming storm. The group decided on a plan to turn the transformer off and stop the turbine. Clementine ends up stopping it, but soon after, walkers show up in which the group will fend them off until another group arrives, which we find out is the man Carver from earlier and his group that takes the rest of the walkers out. Carver commands everyone to head inside, in which he goes to violently ask to where Rebecca is. Now, from here, your choice depends on whether anyone stays alive or not, but in the end, Carver decides to take them all back to his camp so they can be a family again, in which this wraps up episode 2. Now, for episode 3, it's not really much to talk about in terms of story, because all of episode 3 is really the group doing work at Carver's place and finding ways to escape. The only parts of episode 3 that are important for us to know is Kenny losing one of his eyes because of Carver, the introduction to Mike and Jane as characters, Bonnie ends up joining the group, Alvin dying in Carver's office, this being dependent on your choice in the ski lodge, Carver dying, Carlos dying, and Sarita getting bit by a walker after the group went with the plan of covering themselves with walker guts to bypass the horde that was due to come towards House. The last two episodes, 4 and 5, are arguably the reasons as to why the downfall of Season 2 happens. Of course, I'll go over it afterwards, but I want you to really pay attention to the flow of how these two episodes go. Now, episode 4 starts immediately in the horde, in which Clementine has to make a decision as to either cut Sarita's arm or kill the walker, which doesn't matter since she ends up dying anyway at the spot the group agreed to go after getting out of the horde. The group collectively make it out besides Sarah, Nick, and Luke, in which Jane and Clementine decide to go look for them. Long story short, Nick's a walker after really no solid explanation. Luke for hours tries to get Sarah to come with him, to leave but doesn't want to. And Sarah, being traumatized by her father's death, doesn't want to do anything at all. Inside the building, Luke and Sarah were bunkered in, walkers showed up, and since Sarah doesn't want to move, you have to decide whether or not to save her. this choice also not mattering since she dies regardless later. The group come back with Sarah alive or not, and thus they try to see if they can find places or supplies or both, as Rebecca is on the verge of giving birth. The team searches, Clementine going with Bonnie and Mike to find some things, but also goes with Jane later on to find a deck that they end up using for Rebecca. They suddenly come across a young man named Arvo who looks to be throwing medical supplies in the trash. Jane notices and goes on to antagonize them about the medicine on whether or not they should keep it for themselves or not. Either way, whether you keep it or not, Arvo leaves and Jane feels guilty about her actions. The group, realizing walkers are heading their way, head to the observation deck Jane and Clementine found. They collectively deal with the walkers by dropping the deck, and finally Rebecca is able to deliver AJ in one piece. A little time passes in the day, and so the question pops up whether or not the group should move to the nearby town or rest for a few days for Rebecca. Also, Jane leaves, but not really. The group, however, will still leave the observation deck, but they soon come across the young man, Arvo, from earlier, who we see surrounds Clementine and the gang in hopes to take their supplies. Fortunately, Rebecca, being still ill from her recent delivery, ends up dying due to blood loss, and Clementine has to decide whether or not to shoot to prevent her from killing AJ. Whether it was Clementine or Kenny that shoots her, the group get into a shootout with Arvo's group. Both groups go back and forth with each other until Jane comes back, finishing off the last bandit. As the team tries to figure out what to do with Arvo, they decide to follow Arvo to the house where his group were staying at so Clem's group can get supplies. The group follows Arvo for the entirety of the day, even deciding to take a rest before reaching the house next day. The group find the house, but the only thing preventing them from getting inside is the frozen lake in front of them. They all decide that it would be best to spread out to reduce the weight, and so they do just that. Walkers end up showing up behind them because of the noise Kenny made earlier with a walker. Everyone ends up making it except for Lucas slowly falling into the lake. Luke tells both Bonnie and Clementine to just cover him, that way he can get his footing. Depending on what choice he makes, still makes it to where Luke inevitably falls into the water. The group head towards the house, wondering what just happened and try to get their bearings in order. During this time, Kenny gets a nearby truck to work. As the team discusses what to do next and where to go, everyone having different opinions, Kenny gets furious and causes everyone to disperse. After some talk with Kenny, Clementine and the gang fall asleep. Clementine, upon waking up, hears a sound that keeps repeating, causing her to find out what's causing it. Clementine then goes outside to discover Bonnie, Mike, and Arvo stealing the entirety of the supplies and taking the truck for themselves. Clementine tries to talk to Mike as to why they're doing what they're doing. Unfortunately though, Arvo shoots Clementine, and thus we see Clementine bleeding out on the snow. We do hear Kenny come rushing outside asking what did the three do to her, while also still being a panic in regards to Clementine's condition. Fast forward and we see Clementine in the same truck Bonnie, Mike, and Arvo try to steal, as well as Jane and Kenny. Jane brings up the question of where they're going since Clementine finally woke up. Both Kenny and Jane get into a heated argument about whether to go to Wellington or head back to Howe's. But the conversation gets deeper as they both antagonize each other, Jane talking about Kenny's family, and Kenny telling Jane that she's a selfish loner. Soon they come to a stop, witnessing the road is blocked off by cars. Kenny decides to go outside to see if any of them have diesel for the truck, since they are low. He then says that if anything were to happen to them, if he doesn't come back, they all should meet up by the nearby rest area. Kenny heads out, and so Jane tries to convince Clementine that they should just leave everything behind. Both of them hear gunshots come from outside and thus see the walkers slowly walk out of the barricaded cars. Jane tells Clementine to floor them out of there, but upon doing that, they crash into a walker, and so both of them end up getting out of the truck heading towards the rest area that Kenny told them to go. Clementine, despite the weather, arrives at the rest stop to meet with Kenny. Kenny asks Clementine where AJ is, but soon Jane arrives at the rest area without AJ. Kenny in disbelief runs outside to find him. Jane then takes the opportunity to tell Clementine to stay out of whatever happens next, and she'll see what Kenny really is. Kenny comes back furious, taking the first swing at Jane, asking why did she kill AJ. Jane in rebuttal says that she didn't kill him and that it was an accident. The two of them get into a heated fist fight with each other that goes back and forth, until Kenny gets the upper hand on Jane, in which he's inches away from stabbing her in the chest. From here on out, Clementine sees the nearby gun after collapsing from trying to stop the fight, and gets the decision as to either shoot Kenny or look away and let Kenny kill Jane. Afterwards, depending on your choice, gives you multiple endings in which you can either end up alone, with Jane, with Kenny, or in Wellington, and either one of those endings finishes Season 2 of The Walking Dead. Alright, so hopefully you got the slim abridged version of Season 2's story, or perhaps you already knew and skipped your way to this part. Since I just went over the story of Season 2, I think it's fair to say, my god, did they miss out on making the story better than what it is currently. I will admit that the writing and the direction of where Season 2 was going was fine up until the end of Episode 2. From there is when everything just goes completely negative. Now, in order to really explain the downfall, I first want to go over the characters in Season 2, because the characters are a big portion as to why Season 2 went the way that it did. Listen to me when I say this. Besides Clementine, because she's the main character, take Kenny, Jane, and maybe Luke out of the equation. Without those characters, what do we have? Without them, there's hardly a season 2. Every character in our main cast either dies or we don't get any sort of explanation as to what happened to them. And the majority of these deaths or situations where we don't know what happened to them are really just BS excuses to get rid of the character, or that the writing was so bad that they didn't know what to do with them. The only reasonable death that I would consider makes sense is Carlos, but everything else is just questionable. Despite your choice, Sarah still dies, Nick still dies, Rebecca still dies, Luke still dies, Krista to this day, nobody knows what happened to her. Then you have Bonnie and Mike, which to be honest, no words, like come on. And then in terms of the antagonists of the season like Carver and Arvo, with Carver, everything led up pretty well until his first appearance with our group. But the problem resides that they rushed his role in the story so bad that he essentially died in the same episode where we were really starting to get to know him better. Like for example, what really happened with him in the cabin group before they escaped? What really went down with him, Alvin, and Rebecca? Side note, do we know anything about Alvin besides that he's Rebecca's husband and that Carver was messing with his wife? Anything? No?
That's funny. She looks just like you.
All that just to throw him away in episode 3. Don't get me wrong, the way he died was cool in a way, but it would have had more of an impact if he was the main villain for the whole game, rather than having Arvo take his role in episode 4. With Arvo, I've said this before, that Arvo existing as a character in season 2 shouldn't be a thing. His situation, I believe, was just a way to fit the narrative to have Kenny and Jane fight in the end. It's such a shame because we had this large cast of characters that had so much potential, yet were thrown to the wayside. Which leads me to my next point, which is the impact of choice, which in this game is nowhere to be found. Remember earlier when I said that the basis of what it seems season 2 was going to be in regards to Clementine was supposed to make her own decisions, and that ultimately her choices are going to matter? Anyways, the reason why I want to talk about the scene real quick is to give you guys a basis of what Clementine was supposed to be more or less shown in season 2. That is to be able to handle herself and make her own decisions. Well, just throw that out the window because there's no such thing. I heard from other people that discussed season 2 saying that season 2 was supposed to be the season where Clementine is in search of her new Lee. In other words, to find someone else that would be able to take care of her. I can see that perspective where in the first 2 episodes you have Luke slowly look like and act like the new Lee for Clementine. Then you have Kenny's comeback, and so that's a clash between the two of them of whom Clementine is going to be with. Prime example of this would be where she gets to choose who to sit with in the ski lodge. But then later on you have Jane, which twists that whole scenario into a completely different direction in the story. I believe, however, that season 2 was supposed to be Clementine's path into making her own decisions and overall her choices having an effect on people. But what's the point in making a choice when that choice has no impact at all? At that point, in this case, Clementine's role in the story seems irrelevant. Almost every instance where Clementine has a choice, she ends up observing from afar, witnessing that her choice doesn't matter in the end. The only time where her choice actually has meaning and changes the course of the story is towards the end where she has to decide to kill her friend that she's known for a couple years, or let that same friend kill a member of the team. So what does it all mean? The idea that her choices wouldn't have much of an impact or purpose? Or was it a showcase that despite her choices not guaranteed for her to have a meaningful impact? Why is it that I have the choice to let Sarah learn how to use a gun when in the whole rest of the game there's no such thing as Sarah using that knowledge to the team's benefit or perhaps detriment? Why not use this choice, though it may seem small, have a big impact later in the game where in a dire situation, Sarah can either save someone or get somebody on the team killed? Why is it that saving Nick from Walter shooting him because of Matthew on the bridge is a useless decision, being eventually killed off? Instead, why not him have a man moment or redemption of some sort where he ends up saving somebody in a shootout to make it up for his Uncle Pete in a way, as well as show that he can take care of himself? Why is the choice to kill the walker or cut Sarita's arm to make it to where she dies anyway? Perhaps it's the narrative slowly making Kenny the antagonist in the later half of the season. Which leads me to talking about the writing direction that season 2 was going towards. Like I said a little bit earlier, that the first 2 episodes were pretty solid, and then afterwards it just became a flop. The best way that I can describe the writing in this particular season is that there's a lot of stories being implemented at once, but aren't fully fleshed out. In other words, there's too many storylines trying to be told at the exact same time that in the end, those stories were either rushed or dropped along the course of the season. I will give the benefit of the doubt that due to time constraints, that Season 2 had to scrap a lot of things, which I can understand, but at the same time, I would rather have the game come out a year later if it meant that the writing was at its best and that those scrapped ideas would have came to life. Season 2 is perhaps the biggest what if in Telltale's The Walking Dead franchise. What if the scrap ideas were fully realized? What if the writing had matched the emotional depth of Season 1? Just imagine, with more time, who knows what the game could have become.